The road into the Gunnison Valley did not ease up at the end. It got harder, the way hard things often do, twisting through stands of aspen gone pale. In the October cold, the wagon ruts deep and frozen at the edges where the melt had come and gone a dozen times already. Edna Pratt sat on the bench of the hired wagon, with her hands folded in her lap and her chin up, because there was no one left to see her chin down, and she had decided that was the same as courage. She was 24 years old. She had buried her father in August and her brother in September, the fever taking them 6 days apart, which the doctor in Gunnison City called a coincidence, and which Edna called the cruelest arithmetic she had ever known. The house they had rented was no longer hers. The money from selling the mule and the tools and her father's good coat had come to $31, which she had folded into an envelope and sealed with wax, because it felt less like surrender that way. What she carried onto the wagon was a leather satchel, a wool blanket, a Bible she did not read but could not bring herself to leave, and a skill she had spent 4 years developing in quiet, the keeping of accounts. Her father had let her manage his ledgers since she was 19, first as a help and then as a necessity, because his eyes had begun to fail him and hers had not. Numbers did not lie to her. They did not leave. They sat where she put them, and they told the truth about things even when everything else refused to. The man at the land office in town had told her about the Aldercreek Ranch. "Macon Briggs," he'd said, not looking up from his desk, "runs 800 head up past the rim. Lost his cook and his housekeeper same week. Needs someone who can manage a house and read a contract without being cheated. You interested?" She had said yes before he finished the sentence. It was not dignity. It was arithmetic. $31 and a Colorado winter did not negotiate. The driver pulled the wagon to a stop in a hard, flat yard ringed by pine fence. The house was low and long, built of dark timber, with a stone chimney at each end and a porch that ran the full width of the front. It was not a pretty place. It was a working place, every board chosen for function, every angle squared against weather and hard use. Edna looked at it and thought, yes, this she understood. A man came out of the barn. He was not what she had expected, though she could not have said what she had expected. He was tall and lean the way a fence post is lean, not slight, but stripped of everything unnecessary. His hair was dark, gone gray, at the temples, his face weathered to the color of old saddle leather, the lines around his eyes deep and permanent. He moved without hurry across the yard, and she noticed his hands first. They were the hands of a man who had never done easy work a day in his life. This was Macon Briggs. He stopped a few feet from the wagon and looked at her. Not in the way some men looked at a woman alone, assessing, calculating, but in the way a man looks at something he is trying to understand. His eyes were a dark, steady brown. "Miss Pratt," he said. His voice was quiet and carried the way quiet voices do in cold air. "Mr. Briggs," she replied. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for his hand. She had learned in the past 2 months not to wait for things. He looked at her satchel, then at her. Then he gave a short nod. "The arrangement stands," he said. "You manage the house and the books. I cover your room, your board, and a wage of $8 a month." He said it clean, no apology, no embellishment. A fact laid flat on the table. "Agreed," she said. He picked up her satchel before she could, not as a gesture of gallantry, but with the same matter-of-fact efficiency with which he would have picked up any object that needed moving. "Kitchen's yours," he said, walking toward the house. "Pantry's stocked. We eat when the work's done." He glanced back at her once, and there was something in his face that might have been relief, if relief could be kept as quiet as he kept everything. "The books are in my study. Such as they are." That last part, she would understand later, was the understatement of her life in Colorado. The kitchen was large and cold and needed a good fire, which she built. The pantry was stocked, as he'd said: flour, beans, dried corn, salt pork, coffee, a jug of molasses. She found a cast iron Dutch oven, big enough to feed a crew, and set about making something that would stick to a person's ribs, which, in her experience, was the most honest way to introduce herself to a new house. She watched Macon Briggs from the kitchen window while she worked. He moved between the barn and the corrals with a purpose that never looked like rushing. Each action completed before the next began. No wasted motion, no wasted words. A boy of about 10 followed him, short-legged and earnest, mimicking his stride with a seriousness that made Edna's chest do something unexpected. The boy was his nephew, the letter from the land office had mentioned. Parents gone to a fever of their own, different fever, different year. The boy's name was Clem, and he had been at Aldercreek since he was 7. When the light outside went copper and the cold pressed harder against the windows, Macon and Clem came inside. They washed at the basin on the porch, passing the soap without speaking, the silence between them as easy as breathing. They sat down at the table, and Edna served them. Generous portions, the pot still more than half full. Then she stepped back from the table, as she had been trained to do in the boarding house where she had worked the winter before her father got sick. You served, and then you waited, and you ate from what was left when the men were through. That was the arrangement of that place, and she had accepted it the way you accept a cold morning, unpleasant but not worth fighting. She stood by the stove with her hands folded and waited. Macon cleaned his plate slowly. Clem ate with the singular focus of a growing boy. When the meal was finished, she expected Macon to stand and leave the kitchen, as men of that type generally did. Instead, he sat for a moment looking at his plate. Then he rose, but not to leave. He went to the sideboard, took the one remaining plate from the stack, and carried it to the stove. He lifted the lid of the pot himself, ladled out a full portion, as full as his own had been, and set it at the empty end of the table. Then he pulled out the chair, set his eyes on her, and sat back down. He did not speak a word. The gesture landed on Edna Pratt like something she hadn't known she'd been bracing against. It was not kindness, precisely. It was simpler than kindness. It was the assumption that she was a person who ate, that her hunger was real, and her place at the table was not a favor to be granted, but a fact to be observed. Her throat closed briefly. She looked at him, meaning to say something, "Thank you," or some approximation of it, but he had already turned his attention to Clem, who was drooping in his chair. She sat down. She ate. The food was her own, and it was hot, and the table was warm. And for the first time since August, she did not feel like a woman standing outside a window, looking in at someone else's life. The silence that settled over the table was different from the silence before. It had weight to it, good weight, the kind that meant something. That night, after the dishes were done, and Clem was put to bed, Edna lit a lamp and sat at the kitchen table. Sleep felt far away. The ranch was quiet in a way that towns never are, and the quiet had a particular texture out here. The wind off the mountain, the low sound of cattle, the creak of the house settling against the cold. She sat with her own ledger open in front of her, but her mind kept drifting. Eventually, it drifted to the shelf above the cold fireplace in the front room. The account books were there. She had noticed them on her way through. 3 of them, thick-spined, leaning against each other like tired men. She told herself she was only looking. She told herself she would not pry. She pulled the first book open at the kitchen table and understood within 4 pages why Macon Briggs had the look of a man carrying weight he had never found a way to put down. The books were a disaster. Not dishonest. She could see that immediately. They were the books of a man who understood cattle and land and weather, and was completely out of his depth the moment a pencil entered his hand. Entries were made in no particular order. Sales were recorded without dates. Expenses appeared twice, or not at all. There were numbers crossed out, rewritten, crossed out again, the arithmetic on the page fighting itself to a standstill. Tucked between the pages were loose papers, receipts, invoices, a note from a feed supplier in Gunnison City, a bill of sale for 12 head of cattle with the price circled and nothing else, and there, folded once and pressed flat between the second and third books, was a letter from the Colorado Territorial Bank. It was politely worded, as such letters always were. The politeness made it worse. The annual lien payment on the Aldercreek property, $450, was due in 41 days. The current balance on record left a deficit. The bank looked forward to receiving the payment in full by the due date. Edna's hands went cold. She set the letter down. Then she picked up her pen and began to work. It was the one thing she knew how to do in the dark. She worked through the night, rebuilding his books from the scattered wreckage he'd kept, cross-referencing the invoices with the entries, finding the actual numbers beneath the confusion. The arithmetic itself was not complicated once she imposed order on it. The problem was not that the money wasn't there. The problem was that she couldn't find where it had gone. By the time the sky began to gray outside the window, she had her answer, and it was not a good one. After accounting for everything, every sale, every expense, every outstanding balance, Macon Briggs was $112 short of his lien payment, 41 days. But she had also found something else. She had found a pattern. For the past 3 years, every pound of beef Macon had sold to the regional cattle buyer had gone through a single broker, a man named Luther Vane, operating out of an office in Gunnison City. And for 3 years, the price per pound Macon received had been consistently, precisely, infuriatingly lower than the prices Edna knew from her father's cattle dealings to be standard for the region. The difference per animal was small. 3 cents here, $1.20 there. But Macon ran a large herd, and Luther Vane had been doing this for 3 years. And the total, when she added it properly, made her sit very still for a long moment. She found the final piece on the back of the bank letter itself, which she had almost missed. The letterhead listed the board of directors of the Colorado Territorial Bank. One of the names was Mr. Calvin Vane, Luther Vane's father. The broker was skimming the sales and funneling the difference elsewhere, and the bank was waiting, patient as stone, for Macon Briggs to fall short of a payment they had helped engineer. They were bleeding him slowly, on paper, in a language he had never been taught to read. The anger that moved through Edna was cold and exact. It was not hot anger. It was the anger of someone who has watched honest work be cheated by arithmetic, and who happens to speak arithmetic fluently. Before the sun came fully over the mountain, she had written 3 letters. One to the livestock auction in Pueblo, requesting current average prices for Colorado beef cattle by grade. One to a neighboring rancher whose name appeared in a bill of sale she'd found. A man named Mr. Dobb, who appeared to owe Macon $60 for a yearling bull purchased the previous spring, and one to a second man, a Mr. Frey from the county east, for $35 owed on a breeding pair. She did not mention Luther Vane. She did not mention the bank. She simply asked for what was owed. She sealed the envelopes and set them on the sideboard. When Macon came into the kitchen at first light, she already had coffee made and a fire rebuilt. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the account books arranged on the table. Neat, squared, her own ledger beside them, open to a clean page covered in her careful hand. He looked at her. He looked at the books. He looked at the faint smudges of ink on her fingers and the particular stillness of a woman who has been up all night, doing something that needed doing. He did not ask what she had done. He understood. In the wordless way, he seemed to understand most things. That something had shifted in the house overnight. "I need to send some letters to town," she said, "when the rider comes through." Macon poured himself a cup of coffee. "I'll ride them in myself," he said. He looked at her over the rim, and in his eyes, so steady, so careful, she saw something she had not expected. Not surprise, not gratitude, exactly. Something that looked more like relief, and beneath the relief, the faint shadow of a shame he had been carrying alone. The shame of a capable man undone by a skill he'd never had the chance to learn. "Thank you," he said. It was 2 words. In his mouth, they carried the weight of a sentence much longer. The weeks that followed found a rhythm, the way life does when it is allowed to. Edna ran the house with the precision she brought to everything. Meals on time, floors clean, Clem's torn shirts mended, and back on the pile before he noticed they'd been touched. She taught him his multiplication tables in the evenings, sitting at the kitchen table with a scrap of paper and a stubby pencil, and discovered that the boy had a mind like a steel trap. He was wild in the field and quiet at the table, and followed Macon the way a shadow follows a man in late afternoon, close and faithful. But her real work was at the kitchen table, after Clem was asleep. Each evening, Macon would come in from the last of his rounds, wash at the basin, and pour himself a coffee, and without quite planning it, without ever formally deciding to, he would sit across from her while she worked. At first, he only watched. Then she began explaining what she was showing him, not teaching him. Exactly. Not treating him like a student, but laying the numbers out in plain language and letting him see the shape of his own situation. She showed him what his costs actually were. She showed him what his sales had been returning and what they should have been returning. She showed him the gap. He was a slow man. She had understood that the first night, but he was not slow in the way of stupidity. He was slow in the way of a man who has learned to be absolutely certain before he commits to anything, because in his world, a wrong decision about the weather or a herd or a fence line had real consequences. He asked questions. He remembered the answers. He began to bring his own questions to the table. Whether to sell the 2 older mares, whether to take on a second hand for the winter feeding, whether the Timothy hay from the East County was worth the price the supplier was asking. They were not conversations exactly, they were consultations. 2 people solving problems with the information available to them. But somewhere in the middle of October, they became something else. She did not notice exactly when. She only noticed that when she heard his step on the porch at the end of the day, something in her shoulders came down, and that when he laughed, which was rare and quiet and always surprised her, she wanted to know what she had said that caused it. The reply from Mr. Dobb arrived on a Thursday. $20 cash, and a note that was more apology than correspondence. A week later, Mr. Frey sent $35 in full, along with a smoked ham, which Clem announced was the best thing that had ever happened to him. They were $47 closer to the payment. Not there yet, but closer. Then came Luther Vane. He arrived on a Tuesday, when the sky was the flat white of coming snow, and Macon and Clem had ridden out early to drive the herd down from the high pasture before the weather closed in. Edna was splitting kindling at the side of the house, the axe her father's, still balanced right, still true. She heard the horse before she saw it. A fine animal, much too fine for this road, ridden by a man who sat in the saddle the way men do when they think the saddle is looking back at them. Luther Vane. He was younger than she had expected. 30 perhaps, with a face that had not yet learned what it would become. He wore a good coat. His boots were clean. He had the hands of someone whose work happened on paper, not in the world, and he held them loose on the reins, the way men hold things they have never had to fight for. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has arrived expecting one thing and encountered another. "I'm here to see Briggs," he said. His voice was pleasant in the way of someone who has practiced pleasantness. "Mr. Briggs is not available," Edna said. She set the axe down and straightened. "I manage the accounts. Whatever business you have with this ranch, you have with me." He smiled. It did not reach his eyes. "I think this is a little above your usual line, ma'am. I'm here on a financial matter. The lien payment coming due, specifically. I thought I might be able to help Mr. Briggs work something out, take some of the herd off his hands, spare him the trouble." "How generous," Edna said. Her voice was mild. "At what price?" Something shifted in his expression. "A fair price, considering the circumstances." "I wonder," she said, "if your understanding of a fair price and mine might differ." She walked to the porch, where she had left her ledger on the railing under a stone. She had brought it out this morning on instinct, or perhaps not instinct, perhaps preparation. She opened it and set it flat before him. "This is a record of every transaction you have brokered for Aldercreek over the past 38 months. And this," she said, turning to the second page she had marked, "is the average market price for Colorado beef cattle by grade and weight, as reported by the Pueblo Livestock Exchange." She let him look. She watched his face change. It was subtle, a tightening around the jaw, a stillness behind the eyes. He was not a foolish man. He could read what was in front of him, and what was in front of him was ruin, written in a woman's clean, even hand. "There is a discrepancy," she said pleasantly, "amounting to a significant sum across the period in question. I have calculated Mr. Briggs's adjustment to your final commission accordingly. The net total you owe this ranch, after correcting for the clerical errors of the past 3 years, is $203. I will expect a bank draft to this address within 10 days. Vane stared at her. A muscle in his jaw moved. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said. The pleasantness was gone now, replaced by something thinner. "I have been keeping accounts since I was 19 years old, Mr. Vane," she said. "I know exactly what I'm talking about." She closed the ledger. "We will not be requiring your brokerage services in the future. All Aldercreek cattle sales will be handled directly through the Pueblo Exchange going forward. I have already written to register the ranch for direct listing." She had done no such thing yet, but she would by sundown, and they both knew she meant it. Good day. He stood on the porch of a ranch that had just slipped out of his hands, and there was nothing in his arsenal for this moment. He had come prepared for a tired rancher and a late payment. He had not come prepared for a woman with a ledger and 4 years of her father's arithmetic behind her eyes. He left without another word. She watched until his horse was a dark point on the pale road, and then she went inside and put the kettle on. Because her hands were shaking slightly, and there was no reason for him to know that. Macon and Clem came in at dusk, cold and tired, bringing the smell of horses and high country cold with them. Macon's eyes went immediately to the porch, the way they always did, reading the yard for what had happened in his absence. He saw the tracks. He looked at Edna. "We had company," he said. It was not a question. "Luther Vane," she said. She was at the stove. She kept her voice even. He went still. It was a particular stillness she had come to recognize. Not fear, but the stillness of a man recalibrating. What did he want? "He came to purchase part of the herd," she said, "to help with the payment. And..." She turned from the stove. "I informed him his services were no longer needed. I also informed him of the adjustment owed to this ranch for the corrections to his past commissions." She paused. He seemed to understand. Macon looked at her for a long time. She could see him doing what he always did, building the picture slowly, placing each piece where it belonged. She let him. "The payment," he said. "A letter came from Mr. Frey this afternoon. The remaining balance. We have the $450. She held his gaze. "I'll take it to the bank in the morning, if you'd like." He sat down. Not heavily, but the way a man sits when something that has been pressing on his chest for a very long time is no longer there. He set his hands flat on the table and looked at them. And Edna thought she saw something cross his face that he would never have put into words. The particular grief of a capable man who had been losing a fight he did not understand how to fight, and who has just been shown, for the first time, that the fight is over. "I didn't know," he said, "about Vane, about the bank, about any of it." "You couldn't have," she said. "It was written in a language you didn't have cause to learn." He looked up at her, really looked, the way he didn't always do, the way she had come to notice the rare times when he did. "I'm obliged to you, Miss Pratt," he said, "more than I know how to say." $8 a month, she said, and turned back to the stove. She heard a sound from the table. It took her a moment to understand it was a laugh. The weeks that followed were different, in the way that all befores and afters are different. The line invisible until you are already on the other side of it. They planned the winter feeding schedule together, heads bent over the kitchen table, the lamp throwing a warm circle of light. He showed her how to read the clouds coming off the mountain. The particular gray that meant ice, the white that meant only cold. She showed him how to project the spring calf count against expected feed costs and price the outcome before it happened. He had the instincts of a man who had worked this land for 20 years. She had the tools to make the instincts legible. What they were building was not what she had come here to build. She understood that, without examining it too closely. Clem was reading by November. Real reading, not just letters, full sentences from the almanac, and then from a thin volume of natural history. She had brought in her satchel because she had not been able to leave it. He read aloud at the kitchen table after supper, his finger tracking each line with solemn concentration, while Macon sat with his coffee and his silence, and the look of a man who is quietly, deeply glad about something he could not explain. The town noticed, the way towns do, when Edna and Macon rode in together to settle the lien at the bank, she in her good dark coat, and he in his wool hat with the brim pulled down. Mr. Hennessy at the feed store watched them tie the horses and said something to the man beside him that made the other man laugh and look away respectfully. Mrs. Alcott from the dry goods stepped outside to tell Edna she'd heard about Luther Vane and used a word to describe him that Edna would not have expected from a woman in a church hat, but which she felt was entirely accurate. At the bank, the teller looked at the payment, exact to the dollar, presented in an envelope sealed with wax, and then looked at Edna. "You the one who put together the Aldercreek books," he said. "I keep the accounts," she said. He nodded slowly. "Mr. Calvin Vane had some words with the manager this morning," he said, in the careful tone of a man sharing something he perhaps should not. "I don't believe they'll be doing business with Aldercreek going forward." "That was my expectation," she said. The ride back was quiet in the way their rides had always been quiet. But it was a different quiet from the first days. It had a texture now. It was theirs. They were almost back to the ranch when Macon spoke. "The deed came up for reassessment," he said. He was looking at the road. "Come January. I'd been meaning to have a lawyer review it, make sure there aren't terms I missed." He paused in the deliberate way he paused before things that mattered. "I'd want you to look at it first, before the lawyer. If that suited you." "It would suit me," she said. He nodded, kept looking at the road. After a moment she said, "I'm not going anywhere, Mr. Briggs." He didn't respond, but she saw his shoulders settle, slightly, in a way that she understood by now was as close as he came to saying something out loud. The declaration, when it finally came, arrived in December, when the first real snow had come down off the mountain and made the world outside the windows a still, white silence. Clem was asleep. The fire in the kitchen was low and good. Macon had come in late from the barn, checking on a mare who was near her time, and had settled at the kitchen table with his coffee and not moved for a while, and Edna had let him not move. She was mending a shirt. He was looking at the fire. "When you came here," he said, "it was a business arrangement." "It was," she said. "It isn't that anymore." He set his coffee down. "Not for me." He looked at her, and his eyes were the steadiest thing in the room, steadier even than the walls. "I'm a slow man, Miss Pratt. I know that, but I'm not unaware." He turned his hat in his hands once, a single slow rotation. "This house has been a different place since you came into it. Clem reads. The books are straight. The ranch is going to be all right." He paused. "I would like you to stay, not because of any of that." Another pause. "Because when you're in this house, it's the right house, and I'd like it to be yours." He was not a man who made speeches. She knew that. This was the longest she had ever heard him speak at one go, and it had cost him something. She could see that in the set of his jaw. "I've been waiting for you to get there," she said quietly. "I was starting to wonder about the timeline." The look on his face, surprise, and then something that loosened all at once, was the best thing she had seen since August. "I told you," he said. "Slow. Steady," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he put down the hat, reached across the corner of the table, and covered her hand with his. His palm was rough and warm and certain, and she turned her hand over and held on. The wedding was in January, small and plain, the way they both wanted it. The reverend from the church in Gunnison City came out to the ranch because the road was too icy for a dress, and Mrs. Alcott came with her husband and a wrapped pound cake, and Mr. Hennessy drove his family over in the sleigh. Clem stood beside Macon in a new shirt that Edna had made him and wore the expression of a boy trying very hard to be as serious as the occasion required, which made him look exactly like the man standing next to him. Edna wore blue wool and carried nothing, because there were no flowers in January in Colorado. She had decided that was fine. She had what she needed already. They said their vows in clear voices, in the kitchen of the house that had become hers, in front of the people who had watched it happen and approved. 6 years later, the morning light came in flat and gold across the kitchen floor, the way it did in October, when the aspens outside the window had gone yellow, and the air had that first cold promise in it that Edna had come to love more than any other season. She was at the table with the account books, because the books were always at the table, because that was her work, and she had never stopped doing it. The Aldercreek books were a different object now than they had been the night she first pulled them down from the shelf. They were clean and logical, and told the truth about a ranch that had grown. 1,500 head, a new upper pasture fenced the previous spring, a second-hand hired on full-time. They were the books of a place that was not just surviving. Clem, 16 now, and almost as tall as Macon, had ridden out at first light. He came back for breakfast and dropped his hat on the peg by the door and said the creek was running fast, but the north fence was holding. He ate 2 plates of eggs and cornbread and kissed the top of the head of the 4-year-old, sitting in the chair beside him, who was his cousin in the way that mattered, and his little brother in every other way, and then went back out to work. The 4-year-old was Edna's son. His name was Thomas, and he had his father's eyes and his mother's way of looking at things, carefully, from several angles, before reaching a conclusion. Macon came in from the barn while she was still working, the cold coming in off his coat for a moment, before the kitchen warmth swallowed it. He poured coffee. He sat down across from her. He looked at the books. "What's the South herd running at?" he said. "Better than last year," she said. "If the winter isn't hard, we'll have surplus by March." He nodded slowly. Thomas climbed down from his chair and went to his father, who lifted him onto his knee without looking, the motion as practiced as breathing. Thomas grabbed the handle of Macon's coffee cup and tried to steal it, which he did every morning and was never permitted. "No," Macon said, redirecting the small hand with a patience he applied to this task more readily than to almost any other. Edna watched this and felt the particular fullness of ordinary things. The books balanced on the table, the boy on the knee, the cold on the morning air, and the warmth holding steady in the kitchen. "Luther Vane left the territory," Macon said, "not for any particular reason. He had heard it in town last week. He mentioned it now the way he mentioned things he thought she should know, simply and without elaboration." "Did he?" she said. "Heard his father's bank is under new management." "That's good news for Gunnison County," said. He looked at her over their son's head. The corner of his mouth moved. "I still think about the way you stood on that porch with the account books," he said. "Man comes here thinking he can take what he wants, and you sent him away without the price of a cup of coffee." Edna set down her pen. She looked at her husband, at the solid plainness of him, at the love she had not expected, and could not now imagine living without. "He thought he'd come to collect what was owed," she said. "He didn't understand that the ledger had already been corrected." Outside the window, the aspens shivered gold in the morning wind. The herd moved slow and dark on the hillside. The house held, as it always had, as she had known it would from the first day she had put her hands to it. She picked up her pen and went back to work.